Hello, hello? Hello, hi. So it's 12:15. I think we can begin. Is my voice okay? Yes. Great. Okay, wonderful. All right, so is everyone here to learn more about getting students to write with fun and communicative writing activities? Great. Okay, wonderful. So, since we're going to be spending some time together, I like to introduce myself to each new group I present in front of. My name is John Kotnarowski, and if you were here in the last lecture, the great lecture on the 6+1 writing traits given by my boss, the Regional English Language Officer, Jerry Frank, you'll know that I'm here in Moscow as part of the English Language Fellows Program. So I came here in September of last year, and I teach classes at the National University of Science and Technology, NUSMISIS, here in Moscow, and I also get a really cool opportunity to go around the country, specifically in my region, talking to people about English language teaching, American culture, all things that I'm really interested in. So as you can see, I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. How many of you have heard of Milwaukee, Wisconsin? Yes, wow. Okay, that I usually get maybe one person who's heard of Milwaukee before. Fun fact, Jerry and I are from the same state. We're both from Wisconsin. Wisconsin. So a little bit more about me, about my professional background. Before I knew what I wanted to do with myself, I studied history and philosophy. So I think those are actually pretty good courses of study for language teachers because you need to be able to express yourself well, both verbally and written form in history and philosophy. And then I moved to South America for a few years and I started teaching English. And at first it was kind of a hobby, and then it became a job, and then I decided I wanted to make it my career. So after making that decision, I went back to the US. I got a master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages from the University of Illinois. And I applied for this program, and I was lucky enough to be accepted. So in addition to writing and writing pedagogy, I'm really interested in using computers for language learning. I'm interested in assessment. I know there's a session going on about the GIGE exam, so I appreciate you guys choosing to come to my talk. And I really like teacher training. I get a chance to work with a lot of new teachers as part of my job here in Russia, and it's really great to work with such enthusiastic, fun, energetic, capable people. So, we're going to be talking about getting students to write. And I've got 3 objectives that I hope to accomplish during this presentation. The first, we're going to spend some time talking about theory, because this is a lecture and I want to make sure we all have a common understanding of some of the terms that I'm going to use. After, I'm going to introduce a few activities. Hopefully, you guys will be willing to participate in some of them. That's my hope, because I think it's a lot easier for people to learn new activities if they do them, as opposed to me just talking about them. And then finally, at the end, I hope that we can have some time to think about how you will adapt any activities that you find interesting for use with your students. So here's a quote that I often use when I'm talking about writing. And I think it really gets to the heart of the matter as to why teaching writing can be so challenging. So it's from a noted American historian and author, David McCullough. It says, "Writing is thinking. To write well is to think clearly. And that's why it's so difficult." So writing is not just letting the words come out of your mouth. Writing is planning, putting your thoughts on the page. and trying to get someone else to understand your train of thought, the way you thought, the way those ideas came to you in your head. In this context, in the foreign language context, in the context where the majority of our students will have limited contact with English outside the classroom, I modified it. All right? Writing in another language is thinking in another language. To write well in another language is to think clearly in another language, and that's why it's so difficult. So that's David McCullough and John Kotnarowski. So, as I mentioned, it's a pedagogical marathon. So we're going to first start by talking about some theoretical considerations. So another one of the big challenges when we talk about teaching writing and helping our students to write well is the fact that when we teach writing, we don't just teach one skill. We have to teach our students to simultaneously manage many different skills to get their message across. So I've got some of them up there, okay? Proper grammar, proper vocabulary, correct punctuation, effective structure depending on the task, organization depending on the task. Rhetoric. Can anybody tell me what's rhetoric? So when we talk about rhetoric, we talk about making a good argument, okay? Creating a persuasive argument and supporting it with good evidence. Part of doing that is logic. And then also, to me, anytime students are writing, no matter if they're filling in the blank or writing an essay, it's going to involve critical thinking, okay? So to me, critical thinking is just problem solving. What's an effective and creative way to come up with a solution to a problem, okay? So one of the ways that we can divide these different categories of skills is into micro skills and macro skills. Again, when students are writing, when we are writing, we're not just using the micro skills, we're not just using the macro skills, we're using a combination of the two to get our message across as effectively as possible. So, as the name suggests, when we use the term micro skills, we're talking about smaller, more detailed elements of language. Okay? How we form words. The difference between the participle and the gerund. Different verb tenses. Okay? From there, after we form words, it's how we make connections between words, how we create sentences. After creating sentences, paragraphs, entire pieces of writing. And then we get into the area of macro skills. So when we talk about macro skills, we talk about things like using cohesive devices to make connections between ideas. Acknowledging and adapting to basic cultural communication requirements. One of the things that I'll talk about is this idea that depending on what culture we come from, we might think about things a little bit differently. And that is reflected in the way we communicate. Another macro skill is giving feedback and responding to feedback, both from instructors and from peers. Okay? So there's a constant balance between these skill sets. Right? And the best writers are able to simultaneously manage all of these things at once. So here's a comment from a biologist named Eric Lindbergh. Humans universally learn to walk and talk, but swimming and writing are culturally specific and learned behaviors. So why is that? Some people learn to write if they come from literate societies, okay, where there's a heavy value placed on putting language into words, as opposed to oral societies. And also, it's a learned behavior. It needs to be taught. So when we talk about writing pedagogy, we talk about the best ways to teach this skill, or these skills. There's a wide variety of different research on teaching writing in someone's first language, in someone's second language. And so a few of the key topics in foreign language writing and pedagogy include the relationship between product and process, the idea of contrastive rhetoric, task authenticity, developing student voice and identity, and making writing communicative. People often overlook the fact that all writing is a communication between the writer and the reader. It can also be communicative in the way it's taught. So not just asking students to write down words on the page, but having discussions and then writing. Okay? So I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to look at these features in a little bit more detail, and then we'll go on to some activities. So, two big words when we talk about teaching writing are product and process. So writing is a compositional activity. There are steps to it, if it's done well at least. Good writers employ a process. They follow the same steps over and over again to produce their final product. And while it's hard to convince a lot of students of the value of following a process, ultimately it's in their best interest to do so, because it makes the activity, this very complex activity, a lot easier by breaking it down into smaller parts. And that takes some of the stress off of them, because I'm sure everyone here has probably tried to write some sort of report, essay, paper at the last minute, procrastinated until the night before it was due. And it's pretty difficult. When I've done that before, I just sit and stare at the computer screen until something comes to me. So, using a process approach helps students avoid that stress. And ultimately, if they are not stressed, if they feel good about it, there's a better chance that they're going to produce something of a higher quality. So here's an example process. When I talk about writing process teaching, writing process pedagogy in my classes, I use an example like this to begin. So starting with brainstorming or free writing, just to generate ideas. After you've got a lot of ideas to choose from, narrowing it down to the one thing that you want to write about. Number 3 is a step that I think a lot of people skip, but I think is one of the most, if not the most important steps. And that's looking at an example of the kind of writing that you want your students to produce. So if they're writing an essay, having them look at a good essay before they start writing their own. If they're writing an abstract, have them look at a good abstract before they start writing their own. So this idea of sample analysis is really important, because then they get a better idea of what the expectations are. There's a saying in English, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, I think in writing, a good example is worth 1,000 words. You could be talking at your students for 15 minutes, or you could show them and they can figure it out for themselves. So after they look at the sample, taking an idea, breaking it apart, and making an outline, okay? So this will be my first idea, this will be my second idea, this will be my third idea. And then when they have those ideas on the page, when they can physically look at them, then their mind starts working, how can I make the connections between these ideas? And after they've done that, after they've started thinking about the connections, then maybe they go back and say, well, maybe my topic was too broad. Maybe I don't want to talk about the American judicial system. Maybe I want to talk about one particular law. After this idea of topic refinement, we move on to the drafting process. So can anybody tell me a synonym for drafting or for draft? Could be sketch, similar to sketch. Can you say it? Exactly. All right, a version. All right, it goes from very rough to more refined at the end. An important part of this process is feedback and revision. So I like to have my students do at least 2 drafts. They give me their first draft, and I give them some general comments. I don't tell them, you missed a period, this word is misspelled. I think those are easier things to notice. I'll tell them things like, I don't understand the connection between your ideas. Or, what is this paper about? Can you narrow it down to one thing? To give them some more food for thought. After they get my feedback, they go back and they make some changes. They add or expand or shorten, make more concise. And then I'll usually have them give their refined version, their second draft, to a classmate. And then with classmates, maybe it's okay to talk about things like spelling, punctuation, more of the mechanics of the language. But I will also ask them to give their perception of the work. So I'll ask them questions like, what's the main idea of this essay that you read? What's the main idea of your classmate's essay? Did the introduction of your classmate's essay make you want to read the rest of the paper? Did the conclusion make you think about everything that had been said before? So some general questions where they can share the way they perceive their classmates' writing. And then finally, submission. So the grade, okay? Or if we're talking about professional academics, maybe inclusion in a publication or an article, or a magazine. So this is an example. This is the process that I use with my students. This is not the best process. This is not the only process. This is an example of one process. And I think as teachers, one of our most important jobs is to give students examples to follow, okay? So just like we're gonna give them an example of the essay that we hope that they write, we give them an example of the process that we hope that they follow. And the idea is they evolve with the process. The process becomes theirs after the second or third or fourth time that they use it. So maybe for a student who doesn't need a lot of brainstorming, they can go through that part quicker. Maybe for a student who really likes looking at samples and benefits from looking at samples, will look not just at one, but 2 or 3. Maybe some students benefit from multiple feedback and revisions from the teacher and from classmates, okay? So we give them the example, and then they start to modify it. Okay. So in the past, the focus was more on the product. So students would be given certain requirements, proper grammar, no spelling mistakes, no punctuation mistakes. And as long as they didn't make those errors, they received a decent grade. Recently, in the last few decades, there's been a shift more towards a focus on the process. Again, because the process helps relieve some of the stress. A lot of students find it to be more work at the start, but if we can get them trained to do it, then it becomes easier and easier to use, more and more helpful for the individual. Students feel less stressed, They better develop their own voice when writing. They become more invested in their writing, and then hopefully the writing becomes better. Hopefully. Okay? There's another expression in English: you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Okay? So all we can do is offer and hope that students will see the value of them. And oftentimes they do. So the question then becomes, what's more important, the product or the process? Well, obviously, the product, or the process, can't be the whole thing. Because if you're entirely focused on the process, then you've never got a product. If we focus more on the product, a lot of times we get lower quality products. So, like in all things, it's about balance, finding that happy place between product and process. So as I mentioned here, the best approach is a balanced one, based on an analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of a particular student or a class. Ideally, we'd be able to spend all our time with an individual, helping them develop their own voice, but that's not the case. We have to deal with many students in a class, and oftentimes many classes. So it is a lot of work. The product provides a window into the student's performance. Okay, so without the product, we don't really understand in writing how well they get the concept. Okay? The product is really important in writing because it tells us, oh, they do understand what a thesis statement is and how it's connected to topic sentences. But again, the process gives students a chance to do the best job possible, getting feedback, and breaking down this really complex task into a number of smaller, more manageable tasks. Contrastive rhetoric. Has anybody ever seen this collection of doodles before? So when I first started teaching writing, I was so happy to find something like this. Okay? Because in my mind, it took all the complexities of writing and reduced it to a series of really easy to understand drawings. Okay? So I can tell my students, when American students write, they're very direct. When students from Asian cultures write, they like to hide the truth in the middle. I'm not exactly sure what the Russian diagram is supposed to represent. The best explanation I've come up with is that Russian writers like to take their readers on a bit of a journey before they get to the final point. So if you look at the date on this, you'll see 1966. So I should have paid more attention to the date when I started using this in my classes, because this is almost 50 years old. And the more I've read on the topic of contrastive rhetoric, the more I found that those drawings are a gigantic oversimplification of the way that people think, of the way that people write. So for example, so first of all, Oriental is not a good term. It's considered a pejorative when we're referring to Asian cultures. But just think about how many different cultures fall under that blanket of Asian cultures, okay? And do you really think that the Chinese literary tradition is the exact same as the Japanese literary tradition or the Korean literary tradition? No, okay? So the more I've read about this idea of contrastive rhetoric, the more I've realized that those drawings, they're nice, but you have to use them very carefully. But there are some powerful ideas behind them. So, it is generally held that language evolves from, is shaped by, and helps to shape the culture with which it's associated. What Kaplan was trying to do with those drawings is express the idea that different languages and their cultures tend to organize their discourse, their communication, in different ways. While the original study was overly simple, overly generalized, could possibly be considered stereotyping, we can still use it to help our students better grasp the idea that when you're writing, you need to consider two things: who you're writing for and why you're writing. Depending on your audience, you will do things differently, and depending on your purpose, you will do things differently. So, instead of using the drawings that Kaplan shared, I like using this triangle with my students, connecting these three fundamental ideas: audience, purpose, and tone. All right? Audience, who we're writing for; purpose, why we're writing; and then tone, so how we write. Okay? Formal, informal, all right? Has ideas of register. Okay. And then I like this. This is my kind of confusing explanation of the triangle. I don't think it's that confusing, actually. I think it's pretty clear, but I think the way it's phrased makes people scratch their heads and then go. So, who we write for and why we write influences the way we write and the words we use. So one deceptively simple activity that I'll get my students to do at MICIS, both linguistic students and technical students, is show them that triangle and then tell them to explain to me its meaning, describe it in one sentence. So I get a lot of different answers, but it's a good critical thinking exercise. And as long as somebody comes up with the idea that you don't write for your boss the same way you write for your friend, I'm okay with that. So again, quickly, audience and purpose. Okay, this is something that can be integrated, probably should be integrated into every writing activity. Just getting students to think about who they're writing for and why they're writing. Okay? So some considerations with audience: who will read my writing? What kind of background do they come from? The background is going to inform the expectations. What level of information do they have? And do they have any values, opinions, or biases about the subject? The purpose: why am I writing? Okay? So we have a chart in my class when we prepare for example, the Cambridge Academic English exam. That's what our linguistic students take at MICIS. There are 5, I believe, different task types. What we'll do before we start writing them is go through and identify who's the audience, who's the purpose, or what's the purpose. And then how will we change our language to better get our message across. All right, element 3, authenticity. Authenticity is a buzzword. I usually hate using buzzwords, but I think this is a useful one. I don't think it's confusing, I think it's straightforward, and I think it's important to emphasize, especially with productive skill exercises like writing and speaking exercises. So when we talk about task authenticity, we just talk about whether or not what we're asking our students to do is something that they will be asked to do in real life. So outside the classroom. So there are many different authentic writing tasks. Some of them are really boring. Some of them are things like filling out forms. One that I've had some trouble with here in Russia has been mailing postcards. And my Russian is very plохо, so that's been a challenge for me. We've got reports, research papers, letters, more and more emails instead of letters. stories, postcards, proposals, memos. So if it's something that students will do outside of the classroom for their own benefit or for their jobs, we can consider that to be authentic. So the second to last consideration is helping students develop their own voice. So just like the way I speak is different than the way Jerry speaks, or the way that each individual in the audience is going to speak, what the hope is when we teach writing is that our students can eventually develop their own written voice. And again, that takes lots and lots and lots of writing to do. But through using a lot of different diverse activities, by engaging them creatively, giving them a chance to have fun with written language, we encourage them to invest more time in the process. Connected with the idea of developing a voice is the idea of developing an identity as a writer. So, for example, how many of you have read Hemingway at all? Okay, cool. So when I hear, or when I think of Ernest Hemingway, when I think of his voice, I think of it as kind of gruff. Somebody who says something, doesn't mince words, and then moves on. And his identity as a writer is one where he only wants to talk about very serious things, life and death, and what it means to be a man. So all of my favorite novelists, all of my favorite nonfiction writers are really good about developing their own voice and their own identity when it comes to writing. Just like public speakers do the same thing. They have their little tricks. Bill Clinton, when he gave speeches, this was one of his tricks. Okay? Some writers prefer very exotic vocabulary. Other writers prefer having plots that mix and twist and come together. But all of that takes time to develop, and all of that needs a lot of creativity. So we're getting to the activities. If you'll bear with me, one more characteristic. So making writing communicative. As I mentioned at the start, we don't have to make the act of writing communicative, because all writing is already communication. Okay? Even when somebody's writing in a journal, that's a person having a conversation with himself or herself. So all writing is a communication between the writer and reader or readers. But when I talk about making writing communicative, I guess I mean making the teaching of writing communicative. And the idea that writing activities should involve listening and speaking and reading and writing. So an ideal activity will give students a chance to interact with the target language, allow students to develop both fluency and accuracy. And I am a firm believer in the importance of fluency. It's probably because I hate grammar so much. I make lots of mistakes with grammar and punctuation, and things like semicolons make me shudder. It will promote all four skills. There will be something produced, okay, because if they don't produce something, then you don't have an idea of how well they got the material. And then finally, just highlight that writing is communication. Even though it's not the same as sitting down and having a cup of coffee with a friend, it's communication nonetheless. Okay, so, ideas for activities. Before we move to the idea part, the activity idea part, thank you, by the way, for your attention and patience during the theory. Any questions before we move on? Great. All right, so I'm going to present. It depends. I think we should probably be able to get through all of these because it's more of a lecture and less of a workshop. Around 10 activities. And for each activity, I want to go through and evaluate it afterwards and talk about what kind of students would it be good for, what its purpose is, whether it's authentic or not, to give you a better idea. Is it focused more on the product or the process? And then finally, can we work culture into these activities? Okay, so first, quick writing. So I teach writing, and what I like to do is get students into the writing mindset immediately in class. And quick writing is a great way to do this. I'll give students a prompt, probably based on what we're talking about in class, or sometimes, after a holiday, or if it's been a while, or if they just had a test, maybe something more fun. And then have them write for 5 minutes about the prompt. So these kinds of activities can also be referred to as brainstorming or schema activation. Schema just refers to everything that students already know before they come into your class. So it gets students thinking about writing, it gets students writing, and it gets them a chance to share what they already know. So let's take a look. An example, quick writing activity. Take 3 minutes and respond, or write a short response to this question. What is the most difficult thing about writing? Or, when I do this with teachers, what is the most difficult thing about teaching writing? After you finish writing, share your answer with the person sitting next to you. So, this can often be done in a conversation, but I think there's a benefit of having students do it in writing. Again, it's not asking them to do an essay or a thesis statement or anything complicated. It's just asking them to say what they would normally say with spoken words in written words. Gives them a chance to think. For students who don't feel as comfortable speaking in class, it's a little bit easier. And then I'll integrate the sharing afterwards. Okay? So they can either do it with a partner or in a group of 3, but everybody has a chance to come up with something before the discussion begins. You're not just picking on people. You're not just calling on people. Some additional quick writing prompts. What's the most difficult part of the writing process? Why? What's your favorite part of the writing process? Why? What skill is more important, reading or writing? Why? There are many reasons for writing. Which is your favorite? Why? And I always include that why. That's my favorite teacher word. Because it's all about making students demonstrate that they understand. What's your favorite part about writing? Brainstorming. Great. Why? Explain. Elaborate. And if you've given them a few minutes to put their thoughts onto the paper, then hopefully they'll be able to come up with something that they feel comfortable about sharing. And again, I always incorporate the little conversation afterwards because that makes it not just a writing exercise, it makes it a written and a verbal conversation. So with this, we can adapt it for literally any audience we want. With my technical students at MCs, we were just talking about abstract writing. So what's the most difficult thing about abstract writing? For my linguistics students, what's the most difficult thing about writing a proposal? For beginning students, what's the most difficult thing about writing a good paragraph or a good sentence? Purpose, again, to activate background knowledge and get students going, to break the ice. It's not authentic, okay? It's forcing students to first write something down and then have the conversation. So I guess you could consider that to be a detractor. But I'm willing to start with something a little inauthentic if it leads to more authentic discussion afterwards? Is the product or process oriented? It's both. They create something, they think about it before they create it, and then they share it, and then those thoughts are shared with the group. Okay, so there are steps. And then finally, is there a cultural application? Well, it depends on what kind of question you ask. So for example, how would you characterize the American style of writing? Right? We could use this to frame a cultural discussion. All right, activity number 2, an illustrated alphabet. Okay, this one is for really beginner writing classes. So the idea is you give each student a letter, and it's their job to come up with a noun and an adjective about that noun. So A, got the armadillo there. So A is for armadillo. Armadillos are amazing. B is for bird. Birds are beautiful. C is for cat. Cats are crazy. Okay? And again, this one is probably going to be aimed at more lower level, probably beginner students. So I like to incorporate something fun where they either bring in a picture or they illustrate their own. So again, good for younger, lower proficiency learners. This is teaching microskills, okay? So spelling. Again, not authentic. There will be authentic activities, I promise. But sometimes we have to sacrifice authenticity in order to get students comfortable and then have them build a little bit more from there. It is focused on the product, okay, the 2 sentences that they create, but you can work a process into it. So for example, brainstorming. How many animals can you think of that start with the letter A? From there, which animal is your favorite? How many adjectives can you think of that start with the letter A? Which describes the animal? So right there, we built in a mini process to create the product. And again, in terms of cultural application, since it's just basic spelling, it's not too culturally interesting, but again, that's okay. We can build from here. So this is something that everybody's familiar with because textbooks are filled with these kinds of activities. All right. Complete the sentence. So here's a dimension when we're talking about these different activities that teachers should consider. It's the difference between a controlled activity and a free activity. Can anybody tell me the difference? Exactly. Yep. So when we talk about controlled activities, students have a lot fewer options. Okay? The activity is designed for them to produce 1 or 2 specific right answers. The teacher or the text has more control. Gradually, we work over to free, where everything that's produced is based on the student. So when we're creating our lessons, we scaffold exercises by starting where we as teachers have more control and then gradually building towards the students having more control, towards the students doing more of what they want to do with the language. Okay? It's kind of like you have to take a test before you can drive. right? You need to have someone in the car with you before you're able to drive. Okay, you need to pass the test before you can do it on your own. It's a good way of thinking about controlled versus free. So, super easy. You can ask students to use specific grammar points. You can ask students, or you can create starters that have to do with the content that you're talking about in class. So these might look really similar to the kinds of activities that you find in textbooks. But the reason I included them in here is because I would encourage you to create your own and not only rely on the textbook. I know time is a factor, obviously. I understand that time is a factor. But if you're working on a tricky grammar point, and for example, last night, you want students to practice using the past progressive, okay? Or the difference between simple past and present perfect. You can create a series of activities that gets them to do that. Okay, it's not just write a sentence using the past simple. No, you start them out, you help guide them, and then they go from there. So again, there are different ways to modify this. Content, so talking about holidays, so it's Easter today. You go to the class tomorrow and have complete the sentence activities based on Easter. Using specific vocabulary, or if you want to use a specific grammar point, you can do that too. Again, I like this because it's easily adaptable for multiple levels, multiple topics, okay? Depending on grammar, depending on vocabulary. It's simple, it's easy, it's a nice warm-up. All right? You get students started with something that's a little bit more controllable. And then hopefully by the end of the class, we can have them writing their own sentences about Easter using the vocabulary that we've taught. Nope, not authentic. Sorry. We're getting there soon, I promise. It's more product-oriented. It's more about the sentences they create. And then again, it does depend on the way that you frame the activity, whether it has cultural applications or not. So, holidays, like Easter, are often culturally specific. So if you want to include some culturally specific vocabulary, like, so I forget, Coolidge? Is that the Easter bread? Right? Coolidge? Is it K or H? K. Okay, so that would be an example of something specific to Russian. Okay? If we're talking about the way I celebrate Easter in the US, we might talk about peeps. Has anybody ever heard of peeps? These really super sugary, marshmallow little chickens. Okay? So peeps, like the noise that a little chicken makes. Peep, peep. So just different ways that you can incorporate the culturally specific vocabulary. Okay, moving on. So now we've got paragraph frames or story frames. So instead of simply sentences, you can have students thinking a little bit more on the macro level, the way sentences interact with one another. So I've got an example that I use often. So John and Cassandra wanted to take a vacation. They had worked hard all year, and it's still controlled, right? Because students can't put whatever they want in that blank. But it's a little bit more free because they have more of a choice in what they include, okay? They had worked hard all year and now wanted to party, now wanted to go to the beach, now wanted to go someplace peaceful, okay? So they have to put something that makes sense in the blank, but it's up to them to decide how they want to make that sense. Okay? And then, Activities like this help teach students the importance of context. So we see here the next two blanks. But where should they go? To blank or to blank? What has to go in those two blanks? There are two places, there are two options. What are those two options? Mexico or Brazil, okay? So they need to look a little bit further on, by context, they have to put that, okay? They can't just put Germany or Kazakhstan, okay? So they go through, they're filling, and again, this is kind of bridging the gap between controlled and free activities, all right? It's still somewhat controlled, they only have a certain amount of options, but they have more freedom to choose. Again, we can adapt it. This one's good because it teaches a little bit of critical thinking, forcing them to look at the context, okay? Some blanks, they can put whatever they want within reason. Other blanks, they have to put something that's been said later on. Another good warm-up, okay? You start with something like this, and then you move on to having students write their own conversations. So you're giving them an example that they fill in, and then they're creating their own afterwards. So, not terribly authentic, unless we're teaching like a screenwriting or a story writing class. And then here's a good example to talk about the product-process distinction. So obviously there's a product, it's the final completed paragraph that they're producing. But they're going through a process to fill in the paragraph, and we can also use it as the first step, okay? Somewhere over here, towards getting them to write their own, maybe for homework, or at the end of class. And again, I think these kinds of activities are a perfect way to work culture into the classroom. It just depends on finding an article about something culturally specific and then modifying it for your students to work with. That's a huge challenge, but also one of the things that I enjoy most about teaching is finding things that work for my particular group of students. So my students are often confused when they come to class and I don't have a textbook for them. But it's because the group of students that I worked with last semester is not going to be the same as the group of students that I work with this semester. So I'm always trying to adapt and create. So this is one of the materials that I'll use. Okay, I won't spend too much time on this, obviously, because lots of people here already teach letter writing. Letter writing is a task that's common on a lot of assessment. Okay, I'm pretty sure the EGA exam has a letter writing component. I know CAE has a letter writing component. Okay. Even more valuable now might be teaching email writing. So as an American, I have certain expectations about my emails and how people should send emails to me. And I often spend a class teaching students how to write emails to me so that they're not offensive. So here's an idea of how we can work a process approach into letter writing. Start with some brainstorming. What kind of information do we include in a letter? Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on this because everybody already knows that, right? Date, greeting, a little pragmatic or cultural application is this idea of small talk. When I'm writing to someone in a higher position, so a boss or someone I'm trying to get a job from maybe. I include this small talk. It's nice to hear from you. Thank you so much. I hope this message finds you well. Closing, maybe a postscript, a PS at the end. That can be a nice little addition. So we get the idea of the kinds of information, and we'll show students an example. And then we can get students to write letters. And so writing letters to friends is fun, it's nice. I think there are other more interesting ways to use letter writing. So one of the things I'll have students do is writing letters to me, to the teacher. So it's going to help them work on the formal letter writing. And I'll ask them to do 3 throughout the course of a class or a semester. So 1, where they introduce themselves to me. 2, where they tell me how the class is going. And then 3, at the end, with like a little mini evaluation on how the class was for them. So what they liked, what they didn't like, what they got from it, what they hated about it. So it gives them practice writing a letter, and it also gives me some feedback. And it's nice because when students are submitting something like this, again, they have time to really put their thoughts into words. So the quality of the feedback I get is often better. And 2, it's a really nice, like, intimate conversation between myself and an individual student. So I make myself available for conversation, for verbal conversation, but I find that I get a lot more detail, a lot more information when I give students the chance to write to me. Has anybody ever heard of Dear Abby? No? So, Dear Abby is a lesson that you can do when you're talking about letter writing. She is an advice columnist, or was, I believe. Do you know, Jerry?
She died. Her daughter.
Okay, she passed away, but her daughter has inherited the advice column empire. So, I forget what the number is. It's an incredibly large number of US newspapers run her columns. And people will write in anonymously with problems that they're having. And they will ask Abby for advice to their problems. Okay? So, instead of using their real names, they'll come up with a little phrase or a little expression that kind of summarizes their problems. So this writer is called Worried About Love. And this person writes, I don't know what to do. My boyfriend and I have been dating for over 2 years, but I think there might be someone else. He rarely asks me out anymore. We don't go to restaurants or shows. He occasionally stays out really late, but blames it on work. 2 weeks ago, he came home and his shirt smelled like perfume. I love him, but I think he's being unfaithful. What should I do? Okay? So, I'll give an example like this. Probably wouldn't give an example like this to high school students. Maybe something about my mom makes me do my homework. Or I don't agree that I should have to come home right after school. And then students come up with creative solutions to these problems. Then from there we'll go on and I'll have students come up with their own problems and then write letters to one another. And so this is an example where we're not completely free yet, but we're pretty close to being almost completely free when they're writing these responses. And with advice, one nice grammar form we can use to highlight modals, okay? So again, not completely free. We'll review modals before we write these letters, and then I'll ask them to include 2 or 3 modals in their responses. That's me making sure that they demonstrate their understanding. All right, last one. I told you I really like tech and computers, and part of that comes from being lucky enough, being privileged enough to teach writing in a computer lab for 2 years. I got to teach writing to students where every single student had a computer with Microsoft Office Suite and the internet. So it was amazing. I got so spoiled. And one program that I'll point out, again, I'm going to put my email at the end. If you would like this presentation, you can send me an email and I would be happy to share it. And all of the links to these websites are included. So Langy is just like what the advertisement says. You write something, it doesn't have to be a letter, okay? It could be a paragraph, it could be whatever you're writing that you're not sure about. And you submit it to Langy. And what they do is, if you're writing in English, they'll have a native English speaker take a look at your writing and give you some feedback. So it's not for free though, because what they'll do is they will match you with a native English speaker who's learning Russian. And then he or she will give you something and you will give feedback on that. Okay? So it's about building these relationships, it's about having these conversations, and it's about helping students teach other students and kind of eliminating the need for a teacher. I mean, it makes the students teachers in the process. So I would encourage everybody to check that out. You do have to sign up for it, but it's free. Okay, and again, for letter writing, obviously can be adapted. Obviously, it's helpful for teaching structure of a letter, what students should include when they're writing a letter. It is authentic, yes, fine. It is authentic, okay? Because even though students, or even though many of us don't write that many letters, some people still do, and there's the electronic variant, email, which we can easily adapt a lesson to cater to. It's both product and process oriented, and it is definitely culturally specific. All right, this is something that many teachers already do, picture prompts. Again, as I mentioned, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you can modify that with picture prompts. A picture can be used to generate, maybe not 1,000, but lots of words. Right? So it doesn't have to be like a picture of a person. It can be a picture of a scene. It can be a picture of a process, like at the beginning when I was talking about audience, purpose, and tone. And it's used for descriptive writing, okay? Comparing and contrasting, all right? And it's more on the free side of this continuum, because you're letting students kind of run wild, letting their imaginations run wild. Sometimes it's almost so free that you need to structure it a little bit to give students an idea of what you're hoping they'll do. So, some more pictures, okay? Compare and contrast two of these people, all right? Or, who's the person in your picture? What's his name, age, profession? What makes him interesting? What is the person doing? Why? Where is he coming from? Where is he going? So, students will write these little descriptions, and then you can group them and ask them to identify the picture based on the description that their classmate has written. So another really fun way, low stakes, just to get students thinking and putting their thoughts onto the page. So it can be adapted. Can be used for brainstorming, creative critical thinking, teaching descriptive writing, comparing and contrasting, story writing. All right. And again, it depends on the context in which you're using it, whether or not you consider it authentic. But descriptive writing is something that students need to do, so giving them chances to write descriptively, I consider to be an authentic task. All right. So, cooperative story development. This is essentially you get students into a group of 5 or 6 people, right? And they have a piece of paper. And you give them a situation. For example, meeting a famous person. All right? And you say, number 1, okay, first person in the group. What famous person did you meet? And they write a sentence. And then they take the sentence and they hide it. And they pass it to the next person. Number 2, where did you meet them and who were you with? So number 2 writes the answer, and they take it and they hide it. Okay? Number 3, what was the famous person wearing and how did he or she look? Answer, hide it. What was he or she like? Answer, hide it. What did you do when you saw the famous person, and what happened next? So what you've got is this activity where everybody's allowed to contribute one sentence, but they don't really know what the overall topic or the direction of the story. And then the last person unravels it, shows all the sentences, and reads it as a story. And it's a really nice way, a really fun way of talking about the importance of coherence. So coherence are the ideas in a piece of writing logically connected. And usually, in something like this, they won't be, okay? There will be different pronouns. Sometimes the first person talks about a man, the second person talks about a woman, okay? So it's a really good idea, it's a really good way to introduce the idea of coherence in writing. Has anybody ever done Mad Libs? So Mad Libs are another one where you're asking students, you're giving them requirements, and then asking them to fill in blanks. So on the right, you've got the categories. So in a class, somebody writes down the name of someone in the room. The second one, someone will write down an ordinal number, so first, second, third, fourth, and so on and so forth. And then they put those randomly generated words into the story frame. And the idea is you want to encourage students to be as crazy, as creative, as fun as possible with this. Again, really adaptable. Again, it depends on how you're using it, whether it's product or process oriented. And these are more just for fun, creative, ice-breaking activities. All right, I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because I think we need to finish up. All right, last internet resource that I use is something called Linoint. So you can see it up there, Linoint. And what it is it's like a cork board, okay? And so what I do is I go on there and I put a question. I put my sticky, okay, on there. Mine is the one in green. It says to my students, what's the most important characteristic of good writing? And then I tell them that they need to respond to it, and they also need to respond to one of their classmates' responses. And it's really easy. All you do is you set up one of these cork boards, and then you send the link to the students. And then it gets this discussion going. So I know a lot of learning management systems have forums built into them, but not a lot of people work at places with learning management systems. This is one way that you can DIY, do it yourself. And it's really nice because it allows students to have a conversation, but in writing. So again, on the presentation, I've got ways where you can find this resource and how to set it up. Okay, so I will quickly go through these last exercises. One really fun one is Diamante poems. So Diamante, I think it's Italian for diamond. And to me, this activity is the epitome. This activity is exactly what a critical thinking activity should be, where you give students some requirements, and then they creatively decide how they want to meet those requirements. Okay, so here's an example of a Diamante poem. Jazz, fast, wild, squealing, improvising, dancing, Coltrane, Ellington, Parker, Goodman, playing, listening, appreciating, rhythmic, historic, movement. Sorry, music. Whoops. So this explains how you create a Diamante poem, but again, an example is better. So you give students the template that they use, and then you brainstorm ideas. Okay. So if we were talking about my home state of Wisconsin, okay, I might start Wisconsin, cold, green, sledding, ice fishing, picking apples, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Madison, Brewers, playing football, watching football, listening to football, fun, cheesy, the Midwest. Okay, so you want to start with a noun and then end with a similar noun. Or one variation is you start with a noun and you end with an antonym, an opposite noun. Okay, so again, in the presentation I have examples of these, and you can build an entire lesson around students creating these poems. Okay, finally, journal writing. I'm sure you guys already do this. This allows students to have a conversation with themselves and also a conversation with the teacher, because the teacher usually looks at the journals. And then finally, I like using thought-provoking prompts to stimulate reaction papers. Okay? One great creative writing assignment is giving students a really good quote about something and then telling them to give you their reaction to that quote. Alright? So, as I studied philosophy, I like Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. And you give that to a class of 15 students and you'll get 15 very, very different answers. So I included a nice one from Bulgakov. Manuscripts don't burn. That one doesn't work very well in the United States. I haven't tried it here yet, I might. So again, this is more of a upper level activity. Okay, finally, in the presentation I've included some links to other resources. Again, I think the best picture that all of you picture takers can take will be in the slide with my email address. Because if you write me, I'll just send you the presentation, okay? Unfortunately, I can't give it to you now for virus reasons, right? Okay? But we've got other great online resources, Post-Crossing, sending online postcards, American English, all right, the State Department English Language Resource website, and then a link to one of my blogs. So, finally, I just want to encourage everybody to try and strike a balance between process and product. Product is really important, but without the process, students often feel stressed and they don't do their best work. Use writing as a chance to let students explore the cultural aspect of communication. Writing gives students more time to think about things. They can think more deeply about things. All right? Intercultural relations become easier and better when people think more deeply. And then finally, use creative, fun, simple, engaging activities to help students realize that writing doesn't have to be only reports. It can be fun, and that the more time they spend, the more they can develop their own voice and identity. So, questions, if you have any, come on up. Otherwise, there's my email. Thank you very much.